What I wish I knew at 21 instead of celebrating like there was no tomorrow was that some nightmares are real. My 21st birthday started like any other celebration. The excitement was palpable, and the air was filled with the promise of a night to remember. I had been planning this party for weeks, making sure every detail was perfect. The decorations were up, the drinks were chilled, and the playlist was ready to keep us dancing all night long. 5 friends, drinks, and an all-nighter planned. We were a tight-knit group, having known each other since high school. There was Riley, my best friend who had always been the life of the party, Sarah, the one with the infectious laugh, Mike, the quiet but dependable one, and Jess, who could always be counted on to bring the fun. We were ready to make this night unforgettable. By 10 p.m. the place was ready, cleaned up and clutter-free. The living room was transformed into a party haven, with streamers hanging from the ceiling and balloons scattered around. The kitchen counter was lined with snacks and drinks, and the smell of freshly baked pizza filled the air. Everything was set for the perfect night. We laughed, played games, and as the night went on, drowsiness settled in. The hours flew by in a blur of laughter and music. We played our favorite games, reminisced about old times, and made new memories. As the clock struck midnight, we raised our glasses in a toast to friendship and the future. Riley decided to stay over, while the others left. It was a common occurrence for Riley to crash at my place after a night of partying. We had done it countless times before, and it always felt like an extension of the celebration. The others said their goodbyes, promising to catch up soon, and left us to wind down the night. We chatted, drank a bit more, and eventually, Riley crashed on the floor. We talked about our dreams and fears, the future and the past. The conversation flowed easily, as it always did with Riley, but as the night grew quieter, the exhaustion from the day's excitement began to take its toll. Riley lay down on the floor, and within minutes, he was fast asleep. Morning hit me like a freight train. The sunlight streaming through the windows felt like daggers in my eyes, and my head throbbed with the intensity of 1,000 drums. I groaned, trying to shake off the remnants of sleep and the effects of the alcohol from the night before. The hangover was brutal, but nothing compared to the searing pain in my stomach. It was a sharp, burning sensation that made me double over in agony. I clutched my abdomen, trying to understand what was happening. The pain was unlike anything I had ever experienced, and it was growing more intense by the second. I looked down to see a crudely stitched line across my abdomen. Panic set in. My mind raced with questions. How did this happen? Who did this to me? The stitches were rough and uneven, as if done in a hurry. The sight of the wound made my stomach churn, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Across the room, Riley lay motionless, eyes open, chest cut open, his lungs missing. The sight was horrifying, and I felt a scream rise in my throat. Riley's lifeless eyes stared back at me, and the gaping wound in his chest was a gruesome testament to the violence that had occurred. My best friend was dead, and I had no idea how or why. Terror ripped through me as I scrambled for my phone, barely able to convey the horror to the 911 operator. My hands shook as I dialed the number, and my voice was barely a whisper as I tried to explain what had happened. The operator's calm voice was a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind, and I clung to it like a lifeline. I was rushed to the hospital, treated immediately. The paramedics arrived quickly, and I was whisked away in a blur of flashing lights and sirens. The pain in my abdomen was excruciating, but the fear and confusion were even worse. I was in shock, unable to process the events of the morning, but Riley, he was gone. The doctors did everything they could, but it was too late. Riley was pronounced dead at the scene, and the reality of his loss hit me like a ton of bricks. My best friend was gone, and I was left with a gaping hole in my heart and a million unanswered questions. The doctor's grim news: I was missing a kidney. The revelation was shocking. I had been unconscious while someone had performed a crude surgery on me, removing one of my kidneys. The implications were terrifying, and I couldn't wrap my mind around the fact that someone had violated my body in such a horrific way. They found a strange black residue where it used to be. The doctors were baffled by the substance, and they had no idea what it was or how it had gotten there. The residue was unlike anything they had ever seen, and it added another layer of mystery to an already incomprehensible situation. As the sun set, fear gnawed at me. The events of the day had left me shaken, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The shadows seemed to grow longer and darker, and every creak and rustle made my heart race. I felt like I was being watched, and the sense of impending doom was overwhelming. My hospital room darkened, and I felt anything but safe. The sterile environment of the hospital, which should have been a place of healing and safety, felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the darkness was suffocating. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the edge of the light. Then around 2 a.m. it came back. The room was silent save for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. I was drifting in and out of a restless sleep when I heard a faint noise. My eyes snapped open and I saw a shadow moving outside the window. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the figure approach, through the window, like a shadow. The figure moved with an eerie grace, slipping through the window without a sound. It was as if the darkness itself had come to life, and it was coming for me. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or cry out for help. A figure with a blue wooden mask and hollow eyes. I was paralyzed. The mask was grotesque, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. The figure's presence was suffocating, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape, but my body refused to obey. With swift, ravenous motion, it plunged a blade into my chest, pulling out my lungs. The pain was indescribable, a searing agony that consumed me. I felt the blade slice through flesh and bone, and the sensation of my lungs being ripped from my body was a horror beyond words. My vision blurred, and I felt the darkness closing in. Darkness swallowed me, and I heard a horrifying realization. He was feasting. The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the figure, hunched over, feasting on my lungs. The sound of tearing flesh and the sight of blood made my stomach churn. I felt my consciousness slipping away, and the realization that I was being consumed was the final horrifying thought that crossed my mind. When I woke up again, I was back in the hospital bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses. They were talking in hushed tones, their faces etched with concern. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and my voice came out as a croak. The pain in my chest was still there, a dull ache that reminded me of the nightmare I had just endured. The doctors explained that I had been found unconscious, with no signs of the attack I had described. They told me that my injuries were consistent with a severe panic attack, and that there was no evidence of any physical harm. I was in shock, unable to comprehend how the events of the night could have been a figment of my imagination. I looked down at my chest, expecting to see the wound, but there was nothing there. The skin was unbroken and there were no stitches or scars. It was as if the attack had never happened. I touched my chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of my breath, and I wondered if I was losing my mind. As I sat in the hospital bed, staring out the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The events of the night had felt so real, and the fear and pain were still fresh in my mind. I knew that I had to find answers, to understand what had happened to me and to Riley. Over the next few days, I began to research, looking for any clues that could explain the nightmare I had experienced. I scoured news articles, medical journals, and online forums, searching for anything that could shed light on the mysterious events. I found stories of similar attacks, of people who had experienced the same terror and pain, but there were no answers, only more questions. I started seeing a therapist, hoping to make sense of the trauma. The sessions were difficult, as I relived the nightmare over and over again. The therapist suggested that my mind had created the horror as a way to cope with the stress and anxiety of turning 21, but I couldn't accept that explanation. The events had felt too real, too vivid to be a mere figment of my imagination. I visited Riley's grave seeking closure. Standing there, I felt a deep sense of loss and guilt. I had survived, but Riley had not. I placed flowers on his headstone, whispering a silent apology for not being able to save him. The weight of his death hung heavy on my heart, and I knew that I would carry it with me for the rest of my life. I looked at a photo of us taken on the night of the party. We were all smiling, full of life and happiness. It was hard to believe that such a joyous occasion had ended in such tragedy. The memories of that night were bittersweet, a reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface. I started keeping a journal documenting everything that had happened. Writing became a way to process the trauma, to make sense of the senseless. I poured my heart and soul into the pages, hoping that one day I would find the answers I was looking for. The journal became a testament to my resilience, a reminder that I had survived the nightmare and was determined to uncover the truth. As the days turned into weeks, I began to find a sense of peace. The fear and pain were still there, but they were no longer all-consuming. I learned to live with the uncertainty, to accept that some questions might never be answered. The sunset, once a source of dread, became a symbol of hope and renewal. I took long walks in the park, finding solace in nature. The beauty of the world around me was a reminder that life goes on, even in the face of unimaginable horror. I found strength in the simple things, in the warmth of the sun on my face and the sound of birds singing in the trees. Each day was a step towards healing, a journey towards reclaiming my life. And so, my 21st birthday became a night to remember, not for the horror that had unfolded, but for the strength and resilience it had revealed in me. I had faced the darkness and come out the other side, forever changed but stronger for it. The nightmare had left its mark, but it had also shown me the power of hope and the importance of never giving up. As I closed my journal, I felt a sense of closure. The journey was far from over, but I was ready to face whatever came next. The nightmare had taught me that life is unpredictable, and that we must cherish every moment. I was determined to live my life to the fullest, to honor Riley's memory, and to never let fear hold me back. With each step, I moved forward, leaving the darkness behind. The future was uncertain, but I was ready to embrace it with open arms. The sun set on my 21st birthday, but a new dawn was on the horizon, filled with hope, promise, and the strength to face whatever lay ahead.